One. Welcome back to another dispatch from Holly McKay. Today we are going to journey down the Silk Road, which is China commerce throughout Eurasia, and go into Afghanistan and see what the Chinese are doing in terms of their relationship to that country now that the Taliban are in power. Holly, tell us a little bit about what's going on.
Well, I think this was really one of the biggest sort of causes of concern. I remember after the fall in August of last year, there was so much chatter, there were so many sort of inflammatory headlines about, oh my gosh, now that the US has left, China is absolutely going to come in, they're going to take complete advantage of Afghanistan, they're going to build houses and bridges and pretty much own the country. And that was sort of a huge I guess, slap in the face to the US and a security sort of concern as well, as the US and China kind of have this push-pull power struggle in the world. But I think in my experience and with my recent trip to Afghanistan, as well as living there through to the end of last year, that really, to me, hasn't panned out as much as all these analysts have kind of been telling us about the sort of China-Taliban relationship. China, for years has sort of cultivated a relationship underground with the Taliban, obviously while maintaining ties with the US-backed Afghan government, sort of behind closed doors, very much like Russia and Iran and other places. China really was very strategic in the way that it sort of maintained this relationship with the Taliban, which made it a lot more seamless, I guess, when the change of power happened. And in theory, tight ties between Beijing and the Taliban, they seem logical. They share a small border. China is sort of able to provide fast funds to the Taliban to kind of make up for their financial shortfall, which is obviously triggered by the international sanctions when the US left. But again, what I'm seeing isn't a completely sort of cozy relationship.
Yeah, I remember that period right after the fall, and I remember in particular many U.S. Washington D.C. analysts were all over that issue, basically saying we just gave Afghanistan and all of its mineral resources to China, and all that kind of stuff. But I also remember looking at the geography of that region and noting that shared common small border that you talk about is primarily a protected national park through which there is very little infrastructure. And in order for the Chinese to actually get to Afghanistan, they have to go through either a Russian allied country or through Pakistan, as far as rail is concerned. So they would have to have built a heck of a lot more infrastructure to make this work, and it seemed like a tougher road to hoe than the analysts in the West were talking about. And are you seeing that those kinds of impediments are part of the equation here, or is it something more along the lines of the Chinese aren't acting in the way that the West thought they were going to act?
I think there are sort of so many components to the argument. I think, to your point, there is that shed border. It's a very rugged, mountainous sort of area where there's actually no road, and there's no rail, and there's no direct route. So, for example, while China wants to buy a lot of Afghan coal, and Afghan has this sort of great quality coal that's obviously in demand right now, given the war in Ukraine, but that coal really essentially just goes to Pakistan. Pakistan packs and ships, and then it does sort of this long journey into China, into whatever other clients Pakistan has for that coal. I believe that sort of China has been exploring a bit of a faster way in, which involves going through Uzbekistan instead of Pakistan, which is a lot quicker. I believe it takes 3 weeks compared to almost 3 months really for the journey through Pakistan. So there are sort of some sort of slight developments like that, but really in a large scale, China hasn't delivered on its sort of promises that it sort of gave to the Taliban shortly after it came to power, or even in those weeks before. And I think that's really frustrated the Taliban a lot. They sort of tend to be looking now at China as being this kind of unreliable ally, if you will. The Taliban is also extremely aware that after this sort of 20-year occupation, that they will not be told what to do by any other country, that everything has to run absolutely on their rules, and any other sort of foreign power, whether it be China or Pakistan or Iran or anyone else that sort of comes in and tries to tell them what to do, the Taliban is going to take a very sort of firm stance against that. And one thing that sort of kept coming up, and it's very hard to kind of confirm and get too many details on. But something that did keep coming up was the China is very concerned about the Uyghur presence in Afghanistan. And of course, anyone who's sort of been following much about China, we're all very aware of these horrible concentration camps that are happening, and the sort of persecution of the Uyghur community who are Muslims. And China kind of tends to brand them as sort of being terrorists, if you will. And Afghanistan has, quite a contingency of Uyghurs there for different reasons. And so sort of one of the contingencies in China wanting to sign development and mining deals is you have to return the Uyghurs to us, and of course the Taliban stance is, but we don't have terrorists in our country. So, we have no reason to return anyone to you because no terrorists live or operate here. So that has been a real sticking point, I think, between the two countries, and probably one of the main sticking points as to why China hasn't moved forward. I also look at the Mazainak, which is this huge copper mine in Logar province. And it was back in 2008 that two Chinese companies won the tender for that copper mine. And, even back then, copper didn't have the value it has now. I mean, we look at smartphones, we look at electric cars, just copper is crucial to all of that. But sort of China got this 30-year lease and then never really developed it. And it was always kind of interesting because you were like, this is so valuable. Why are they not doing anything? There are challenges with the mining because there are Buddha artifacts there and Zoroastrian artifacts. And of course, they all have to be preserved as well. And the Taliban is aware of that. But my understanding when I would talk to the Taliban officials about it is, well, we're going to honor the contract, even though it was inked by the corrupt sort of former government. We'll honor it, but if they don't develop it now and start, we're ripping it up. So I don't exactly know how long this kind of window that China really has to start it before the Taliban says, no, we're not, we're sort of going to honor that contract. And of course, that would be quite the rift because it is sort of a huge copper facility that many countries would want to get their hands on for different reasons. So I'm seeing a lot of very sort of push-pull, and you see a lot of Chinese people and Chinese developers, and I talk to mining people, and they're always telling me, a company came in yesterday, another company came in last week, but there is actually really no physical deals that are happening. And I think China is still concerned about security as well, even though the war itself essentially is over. But, there are sort of security concerns that foreign companies still have in Afghanistan. But there is just sort of a lot of chatter with very little movement. I think that has frustrated the Taliban a lot.
I can see that. Well, so that's an interesting explanation of one side of it, of them being hesitant to enter into deals that look like they're giving into yet another global power as far as giving up the appearance of sovereignty. And then when you combine that with the fact that, if you really take the time to look at a map of Western China, there's not a lot of infrastructure there. There's like, a couple of little roads that go back and forth, but it's not like the industrial rail system that exists going westward. So yeah, very interesting that in the end the Chinese economy, even though it needs a lot of natural resources, it's curious that they've not been more aggressive in terms of exploiting ones that they have access to. I think the same thing's happening to them in Africa in terms of they get a lot of these leases, but then things slow down for some reason. And not quite sure exactly what the explanation of that is. That's a different interview, of course, because that's a study of what's happening in the Chinese economy. But interesting to see the artifact of it playing out in Afghanistan, in a place that the West really thought right at the middle of 2021 that there'd be Chinese People's Liberation Army people all over the place, and it hasn't happened.
And I think really too, it's sort of a misnomer as well that everybody sort of thinks, but China and Russia and these places, they've recognized the Taliban, and that's actually not true. No government has formally recognized the Taliban. Yes, China and Russia and Iran, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, they have sort of special envoys, and they have diplomatic missions open in Kabul, but they haven't actually formally recognized and accepted the Taliban as the government. And I think that there was a lot of hope that during this recent meeting for Congress in China, that the CCP would recognize Afghanistan. But to my knowledge, that really hasn't happened, and I haven't even really heard how much the Afghanistan issue even came up during those meetings. So I think that's also something that is really sort of bothering the Taliban as well, is that they have these surrounding countries that sort of want deals or development deals, or somehow, you know, want to be part of the import-export trade, but yet still haven't sort of officially come forth to sort of recognize the Taliban. And I think that really is still a fear of the United States. I think the Taliban is very aware to, a lot of the officials will say, you know, once the US does something, people follow. So their goal in really is to be recognized by the United States. I think that is still a fair way off, but really that's their sort of token that they kind of keep pushing, because they're aware that once that happens, other countries will follow suit. But it is interesting to me that even sort of China hasn't officially done that yet.
Oh, really? You know, well, that's news to me, because yeah, when we left it, when you and I were talking during that period of time, that the Chinese and Russian embassies had not closed.
Right, and
As
they're open, absolutely, but
Yeah.
they still, it's operating under you know, the guise of being sort of a special mission, as opposed to being sort of formal diplomatic ties.
Okay, so they don't actually have formal recognition, nor do they have formal ambassadorships or anything like that set up between the two countries. So, well, so it sounds like the whole world is still waiting to see whether or not this regime survives when all is said and done.
Yeah, yeah, it's still a lot to be ironed out.
Yeah, there you go. Well, that's actually a very interesting update. I had thought that those diplomatic missions were more entrenched than they actually are, and so that's a bit of news to me, actually, in terms of the status of where things are vis-a-vis these countries on a diplomatic level for those purposes. And fascinating, of course, and the golly, I mean, you know, I when I talk to you and I get these updates, and which are really, when I really think about it, you know, you just put egg in the face of all of these analysts that were conjecturing all of last year, and about the, you know, the threat of China to the world, and how aggressive they were going to be. And then you go on the ground, and the story's completely different. And you know, I think it's important that truth from the ground
Yeah,
be heard.
I mean, I just think that is the state of news in general, really. We see so much speculation that this happened, and we don't see enough people going on the ground and doing the reporting. So I encourage I encourage that.
Yeah, I do too. And because you actually get a better perspective of the
Yeah,
world.
there's just no equivalent. I mean, I can sit here too and think this may happen, but even when I think I know a lot, and then I go back and suddenly it's the local people that are telling me, well, this and this, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, like how do I not know this? So
Yeah,
it's just it's the education that's irreplaceable.
there you go. Well, and I learned something today as well. Okay, well, thank you very much, Holly, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Dennis.